Soasta, and I think what's kind of interesting about all technologies in the Silicon Valley is that the good ones tend to come from a business problem that you personally have had or had to deal with, and Soasta is really no different. I've been building startup companies for 30 years in the Silicon Valley, and 10 years ago I had a company called Dorado. It was a SaaS-based company that did loan origination for the major banks, and so it's the backbone for mortgage transactions for Chase and several other big mortgage bankers. And one of our customers asked me 10 years ago, right before they were signing up, said, "Tom, what happens if mortgage rates drop tonight and 100,000 people hit your website, our website, tomorrow morning? You're a small company. Are you going to be able to scale? And can you handle it? Will the application blow up? What's going to happen?" And Soasta, to some degree, is a direct spin-off of the really bad answer I gave for 15 minutes, which was, at the end, "I don't know." And the answer that I gave them that night was, the ability to simulate 100,000 users is very difficult in three different areas. One, the testing software is very expensive, and back in that day, it was there was Mercury, Load Runner, there was Rational, and Silk. Those were the three big testing services out there. And all of them, to do a few thousand users, which you'd spend $1 million to do it on software to just create that. And actually, I wouldn't even know how to ask that question, because if to do 100,000 users, it was way beyond any capacities I had to spend. The second problem was hardware, and that was the bigger problem in my view, because you could only generate a couple hundred users per server. So if you're trying to simulate 100,000 users hitting a site at one time, you're talking literally of thousands of servers, and no one's going to no one has thousands of servers in their back test lab. In fact, Jonathan Schwartz was on my board at Dorado, and I asked John one day, "How many servers do you have in your test lab that I might get?" And after he said, "You wouldn't get any of them," but there was only a couple thousand. And so I knew this was a big problem, because it wasn't just the Dorado problem. It was any of us that were doing SaaS-based applications, and it was any of us that were trying to do it in web scale. There just wasn't test labs big enough. And then the third problem was people. Could you find the people to build these tests and to analyze these kinds of problems? When I began to back away from my own personal problem at Dorado, I realized, we're not alone. All my friends are building dynamic web apps that are using dynamic content. It was kind of before we started using video out of the internet and some of those things, but we were early days of Flash and early days of that kind of video and animation and those kinds of things. And so I knew that this was a problem that was broader than me. And as I began over a couple year period, I began to talk to people about how do you test your applications. And what I found was the dirty little secret within web application development was we don't. We test functionally every day and constantly. But in terms of performance testing, we just don't, because of the problem set that I described earlier. It was just too expensive. And it gnawed on me, because all of us are using our websites as our sales and marketing distribution channels, and yet we're pushing them out and using our end users are becoming the virtual or digital description of a test crash dummy, and from my perspective, that just was kind of silly. And Ken Gardner and myself, who started Soasta, and we partnered in the past in building companies like Sagent in the business intelligence area, and we began to look at this problem in much deeper ways, and really exploring grid architectures and arrays and things like that. And about 2005, we started hearing this concept. The early days of cloud computing was called elastic computing, and there was guys like Reuben Cohen up in Toronto kind of pushing it forward, and others. And we got involved with, the process of this, and we began to recognize if cloud computing, and the promise back in those days of cloud computing was access, availability, and affordability to infinite compute power, which is a bold, at best, projection, actually came into play where you could have access to thousands of servers for, say, 40 cents a server hour, and you could provision those very quickly, use them for 5 or 6 hours, and then tear them down. That's the perfect case study for cloud computing and for performance testing. And so we began to realize this is a good fit.